He had been going to parent-teacher night for 12 years. Not 12 years in the same school. His daughter Imani had moved through elementary, middle, and now the third year of high school, and the schools and the teachers and the rooms had changed with each transition, but the practice had not changed. He went. He sat in the small chairs. He listened. He asked questions. He came home with notes. He had been doing this for 12 years at every school in every small chair, and he had never missed one. His name was Desmond Aurelius Wright. He was 57 years old. He was a senior acquisitions editor at a publishing house that specialized in academic and reference texts, a position he had held for 11 years after 12 years as an editor at 3 other houses, and 2 years before that as an editorial assistant, who had been told by his first supervisor that he had good instincts and needed patience, and who had taken both parts of that assessment seriously. He had good instincts. He had patience. He had been a senior editor for 11 years. He had published 347 titles. He was also Imani's father, which was the more significant fact and the one he would have led with in any self-description that was not constrained to professional context. Imani was 17. She was a junior at Millbrook Preparatory High School, which was a selective independent school that her mother had found through a combination of research and a friend's recommendation, and which Imani had tested into at 14, and which she had been attending for 3 years, with the specific engaged ferocity of a student who has found the environment that matches her capacity. She was studying literature and mathematics, and was very good at both, and was interested in the way the two disciplines spoke to each other at the edges, which was the kind of interest that Desmond recognized as the beginning of something larger, but that he did not name for her because she was still finding what it was, and naming it too early would constrain it. Her mother, Yvonne, was a pediatrician. She had a practice 40 minutes north of the city that had grown from 2 physicians to 6 over 12 years. She worked long hours on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and parent-teacher nights were on Thursdays, which meant Desmond attended alone, which was fine. He was the one who took the small chair meetings seriously in the particular way that required full attention over 3 hours and careful notes and the capacity to ask follow-up questions after the teacher had said the first thing, because the first thing was usually a summary and the follow-up question was where the actual information was. He was good at this. He had spent 25 years asking follow-up questions of people who were summarizing and who had more to say if asked. He had been going to Imani's school events alone for the full 12 years, not because Yvonne did not care she cared as much as he did, and was as informed about Imani's academic progress as he was, but because the scheduling of her practice and the scheduling of the events had produced a consistent pattern in which his attendance was possible and hers was not. He had never experienced this as a burden. He had experienced it as the specific form that his contribution took, and he had taken it seriously in the way he took seriously the specific forms that any contribution he made could take. He had brought notes home from every event for 12 years. He and Yvonne reviewed the notes together, usually on the Saturday morning after the Thursday event over coffee, in the methodical way they had developed for anything that required joint decision-making. She would read. He would add context. They would form a view. This was how they had made every significant decision about Imani's education for 12 years, and it had worked, the evidence being Imani at 17, in her 3rd year at Millbrook Prep, studying at a level that both of her parents had worked toward, and that Imani had exceeded in ways neither had fully anticipated. He had worked his way through the publishing industry the slow way, which was the way that produced the most durable knowledge of it. He had started as an editorial assistant in his mid-20s, which was a role that required the capacity to do everything that was needed and nothing that was not delegated, and to understand the difference between those two categories, which was not always clear. He had been good at it. He had moved to associate editor, and then senior editor at 2 subsequent houses, and at each transition he had carried with him the accumulated understanding of what the previous role had produced, so that by the time he reached senior editor, He had a complete picture of the editorial process from the inside that was not available to people who had entered it at a higher level. He had published 347 titles. Each one had required a different relationship with a different author and a different set of decisions about what the book needed to be and what it needed to say and in what order. And the cumulative weight of 347 such relationships had produced in him a specific kind of patience with complexity. The patience of someone who has learned that most things that are worth understanding require sitting with them longer than they immediately seem to require. He had applied this patience to parenting. He had applied it to Imani's education. He had applied it to the parent-teacher night meetings where the patience meant not cutting off the teacher's first statement, but waiting for the follow-up question to reveal the deeper thing the teacher was observing. He had applied it to the hallway encounter with Craig Morrison, not in a way that made him passive, but in a way that allowed him to process the encounter clearly rather than reactively, and to produce within 2 hours the precise sequential account that became the 5-paragraph complaint. He had a particular respect for teachers. He had developed it over 12 years of parent-teacher nights and over a longer period before that, during which he had observed from the editorial side of academic publishing what it took to produce knowledge that was clear enough to be taught, and teaching that was clear enough to produce knowledge. The teachers he had met at Millbrook Prep over 3 years were, by his assessment, very good at their jobs. Not all of them equally good at all things, but all of them specifically and demonstrably good at the particular thing that made the parent-teacher night conversations worth having, which was knowing his daughter. They knew Imani in the specific way that teachers know students who are present in their classes and fully engaged with the material, which was different from the way a parent knows a child, and different from the way a student knows herself, and the 3 ways of knowing taken together gave Desmond and Yvonne on Saturday mornings the most complete picture of Imani's development that was available. He had said to Yvonne, after the 2nd year of Millbrook Prep parent-teacher nights, "These teachers know her." Yvonne had said they do. He had said not generically, specifically. She had said yes. He had said Mrs. Castellano knows what kind of question Imani asks in class versus what kind of question she asks on paper. Yvonne had said, "How did you learn that?" He had said, "I asked her." She had said, "Of course you did." They had been married for 19 years. She knew what he did with follow-up questions. Imani was the kind of student who made her teachers' jobs interesting and occasionally complicated, which was not a bad thing to be. She was rigorous about the subjects she cared about, and impatient with the aspects of school that seemed to her to be about compliance rather than learning, and she had learned over 3 years at Millbrook Prep to manage this impatience with increasing sophistication. She was not a perfect student. She was the kind of student who was going to do significant things later, which was not the same as being perfect now, and the teachers who understood the distinction were the ones who knew what to do with her. Mrs. Castellano was one of them. She had told Desmond at the 1st year's parent-teacher night, "Imani argues with the text." He had said, "Is that a problem?" She had said no. She had said, "It is a method." She had said she is learning to argue with precision. He had written that down. He had been going to Millbrook Prep's parent-teacher nights for 3 years. The format at Millbrook Prep was different from the elementary school format and the middle school format. It was a rotating schedule where parents moved between classrooms in 15-minute intervals with a 5-minute passing period and saw each of their students' teachers in sequence. The sequence was set by the school. He had learned the format in the 1st year and had optimized his approach to it, arrive 2 minutes before the first appointment, take brief notes during each meeting, use the passing period to review what had been said and what he wanted to ask in the next room. The passing period was 5 minutes. He used 4. He had been going to Millbrook Prep's parent-teacher nights for 3 years. The format at Millbrook Prep was different from the elementary school format and the middle school format. It was a rotating schedule where parents moved between classrooms in 15-minute intervals with a 5-minute passing period and saw each of their students' teachers in sequence. The sequence was set by the school. He had learned the format in the first year and had optimized his approach to it. Arrive 2 minutes before the first appointment. Take brief notes during each meeting. Use the passing period to review what had been said and what he wanted to ask in the next room. The passing period was 5 minutes. He used 4. He had been registered for the event through the school's parent portal, which required logging in with his parent account credentials and selecting his availability windows and confirming his daughter's teacher schedule. He had done this the week the registration opened, as he always did, because early registration allowed him to confirm the sequence of meetings before the schedule filled, and because confirmation early reduced the possibility of a scheduling gap that would require coordination with the front desk on the night itself. He had been registered. The confirmation email was in his inbox. He had it on his phone. He had arrived at 6:30 for a 6:45 start time. He had checked in at the front table, which was staffed by 2 school administrators who were looking up parent names in the system and providing schedule cards. He had given his name. They had found it in the system. They had given him the schedule card, which had his name and Imani's name on it, and the room sequence for the evening. They had not given him a visitor badge. He had not been told there was a visitor badge. He had taken the schedule card and gone to his first appointment. The incident happened in the 3rd year on a Thursday evening in October. The man who approached him in the hallway was named Craig Morrison. He was 36. He had been a facilities coordinator at Millbrook Prep for 8 months, which was a role that involved managing the physical operations of the school during events, the setup and teardown of classrooms, the management of the building's systems during evening events, the coordination of security and parking and building access. He wore a Millbrook Prep facilities polo and had a radio on his belt. He had come to the facilities coordinator role from a background in physical security. He had worked as a security officer at 2 commercial properties before taking the school position. The security officer background had given him a specific set of instincts around access verification that were appropriate in commercial security contexts and less appropriate in the context of a school's parent-facing events. The training he had received at Millbrook Prep's orientation had not explicitly addressed this distinction. It had covered the visitor badge system and the check-in procedure and the facilities coordinator's responsibilities during events, but it had not explicitly said, your role is not to conduct secondary verification of visitors who have already completed check-in. It had not said this because the training designers had assumed the distinction was self-evident. The training redesign that Holloway and Cavallo implemented after the review included explicit instruction on this point drawn directly from the 3 complaint descriptions of what Morrison had actually done. The new training said a visitor who has checked in at the front desk has completed the verification process. Your role during events is to assist visitors and to manage the facility, not to re-verify visitors who have already been verified. If you have a concern about a specific visitor, you should contact the event administrator, not conduct your own verification. The new training was specific because the old training had not been, and the lack of specificity had been part of the gap that allowed 8 months of incident to accumulate before the 3 complaints were read together. He approached Desmond at 7:43 during a passing period between Desmond's meeting with Imani's AP chemistry teacher and his meeting with her AP literature teacher. Desmond was in the hallway outside the chemistry wing reviewing his notes from the chemistry meeting. Morrison said, "Sir, do you have your visitor badge and parent ID?" Desmond looked at him. He said, "I checked in at the front desk when I arrived. They have my name and Imani's ID number on file. I have my parking permit from the school system on my phone." He showed him the phone with the parking permit visible. Morrison said the visitor badge should be displayed. If you checked in, they would have given you a badge. Desmond said, "I checked in at the table in the front entrance. They looked up my name and Imani Wright's ID number and confirmed my registration and gave me the schedule." He showed him the schedule card, which had Millbrook Prep's logo on it and Imani's name and his name and the room sequence. Morrison said, "That's the student schedule. I need to see a parent visitor badge." All parents are required to display a visitor badge during the event. Desmond said when I checked in. I was not given a visitor badge. I was given the schedule card. If there is a visitor badge requirement that I was not informed of at check-in, I would suggest the issue is with the check-in process, rather than with me. Morrison said I need to see a visitor badge, sir. Desmond said I am Desmond Wright. My daughter is Imani Wright, a junior. I have a scheduled appointment with Mrs. Castellano in room 214 in approximately 3 minutes. If you need to verify my registration, I can walk with you to the front desk and they can confirm it, or you can call ahead and ask them to confirm it while I continue to my appointment. Morrison said if you can't produce a badge, I need to ask you to wait here until this can be resolved. Desmond said I am not going to miss my appointment with my daughter's AP literature teacher in order to wait in the hallway. I have a scheduled appointment. I checked in. My registration is in the system. If this needs to be resolved, I suggest we resolve it by calling the front desk who can confirm everything I have just told you while I continue to my appointment. He said this in the tone he used when he was being completely clear and did not intend to be unclear. He had developed this tone over 25 years of editorial work, during which the capacity to be completely clear without being aggressive had been the difference between a productive conversation and an unproductive one many times. He walked to room 214. He knocked. Mrs. Castellano opened the door. He said, I apologize for the delay. She said, not at all, come in. He went in. He had 13 minutes with Mrs. Castellano, which was 2 minutes less than the scheduled 15 because of the hallway delay. He used the 13 minutes efficiently. He took notes. He asked one follow-up question. He thanked her. He left and went to his next appointment. He had 4 more appointments after that. He did not see Morrison again in the hallway. He completed the schedule. He went home. He sat at the kitchen table with his notes from the evening and wrote down what had happened with Morrison while it was still fresh. He wrote it in the order it occurred. He wrote what Morrison had said and what he had said, and the specific framing of each exchange. He wrote it in the same format he used for editorial notes, precise sequential, without editorializing because the editorializing was for later, and the facts were what needed to be captured now. He had written editorial notes for 25 years. He could produce a precise sequential account of a conversation from memory within 2 hours of the conversation. He produced one. He had also written down separately what he had observed beyond the exchange itself. He had noted that Morrison had approached him during a passing period, not during a classroom meeting. He had noted that the hallway at the time had had 4 other parents, visible 2 of whom he had passed in the preceding 90 seconds and who had not been stopped. He had noted that he had completed check-in at the front desk, had received the schedule card with both his and Imani's names on it, had not received a visitor badge, and that the check-in table had not mentioned a visitor badge requirement. He had noted that when he had gone to room 214, Mrs. Castellano had opened the door without any sign that she was expecting anyone other than Imani's parent, which suggested that the visitor verification system in place at the school was the check-in table, not the badge. He had observed these things while they were happening because he was the kind of person who observed. He had spent 25 years in editorial work reading documents for the gap between what was claimed and what was demonstrated, and this habit had not stayed inside his professional life. It had become the way he processed events in general. He observed, he noted, he wrote it down. He had always done this. His daughter had inherited it, which was a fact he had not consciously planned, but that he recognized as inevitable in the retrospect. He looked at what he had written. He thought about whether to file a complaint. He looked at what he had written. He thought about whether to file a complaint. He thought about this the way he thought about editorial decisions, not in the heat of the response, but with the specific calm of someone who has learned that the most useful thinking happens slightly after the thing that prompted the thinking, when the heat has dropped to a level where clarity is possible. He thought about it for an hour. He decided yes. He filed the complaint through the school's parent portal the following morning. He described the incident in 5 paragraphs. The first paragraph gave the context who he was, who his daughter was, the purpose of his attendance at the event. The second paragraph described the check-in process and what documentation he had received. The third paragraph described the hallway interaction with Morrison in the sequence it had occurred using the language that had actually been used. The fourth paragraph noted that he had been delayed 2 minutes from his appointment as a result of the interaction, and that he would like to understand what the visitor badge requirement was and whether it had been communicated to him at check-in. The fifth paragraph said, "I am also asking whether there have been prior complaints about visitor identification requests during school events. If there have been, I would like to know whether those complaints have been reviewed in sequence or individually, because the pattern of such complaints may be more informative than any individual complaint read alone." He had thought about whether to mention Imani in the complaint. He had decided not to. The complaint was about his experience as a parent at a school event, and about the institution's conduct toward him in that capacity, and Imani's presence in the story was context rather than content. He was not filing the complaint on her behalf. He was filing it on his own behalf, and on behalf of the principle that a parent registered for a school event should not be required to demonstrate his authorization to be at the event after he had already demonstrated it through the check-in process. He had kept Imani out of the complaint, not to protect her from anything, but because she was not what the complaint was about. The complaint was about the check-in process, and about what happened after it. The complaint would stand on that basis or not stand at all. He had written the fifth paragraph last, after the 4 preceding paragraphs were complete. He had sat with the first 4, and looked at them and understood that they were necessary, but not sufficient. They described his experience, which was what a complaint needed to do, but they did not ask for the thing that was most likely to make the complaint useful beyond his individual experience. The most useful thing the complaint could ask for was a sequential review. He had asked for it. He had arrived at the 5th paragraph from 2 directions simultaneously. The first was editorial. He knew from 25 years of editing academic texts that the most useful information about any phenomenon was usually the information about the pattern rather than the individual instance. A single data point described one thing. Multiple data points described the thing's behavior over time, which was a different and larger kind of description. He had spent 25 years editing texts that made this distinction and that demonstrated why it mattered. The second direction was personal. He had been aware walking through the hallway after the encounter with Morrison of the 2 other parents he had passed who had not been stopped. He did not know what those parents looked like. He had not been paying attention to them specifically. He knew that he had passed 2 parents without being stopped, and had then been stopped. He knew that the selective nature of the stopping was the thing that needed to be understood, and that understanding selective conduct required knowing the full set of instances, not just the one he had experienced. He had put both of these understandings into the 5th paragraph. The 5th paragraph was the paragraph that asked for the full set. Elena Marquez had read it and had understood what it was asking. She had gone and found the full set. What the full set contained was the pattern that the individual complaints had each described in pieces. He had not known there was a full set when he asked for it. He had suspected there might be. He had known that asking for the sequential review was more useful than not asking for it, even if the sequential review produced nothing. If the sequential review produced nothing, the complaint was still on the record. If the sequential review produced something, the something was what made the complaint matter beyond his individual experience. The 5th paragraph was the thing that created that possibility. He had written it in the same calm he had written the preceding 4 because the possibility it created was worth creating whether or not it produced an outcome. And because producing the possibility was what he could do, and doing what he could do was what the situation required. The complaint was received by the school's parent relations director, a woman named Elena Marquez, who had been in the role for 5 years. She had received parent complaints before, most of them about curriculum decisions, scheduling, and facilities, and she had also received on 2 prior occasions complaints about interactions between facilities staff and parents during evening events. Elena Marquez was the person at the school who read parent complaints. She read them thoroughly, which was not a universal practice among the people she knew in similar roles at similar institutions. Some of them read for summary and responded to the summary, which was faster but sometimes missed the specific detail that was doing the most work in the complaint. She read for the detail. She had learned to do this in the first year of the role after she had responded to a complaint summary and had received a response from the parent that said, "But you missed the part where I said." She had gone back and read the part where they had said. It had been the most important part. She had not missed it since. She had read both prior complaints. She had logged them. She had managed the response to them. She had not read them alongside each other because the complaints had arrived at different times, and the process she used for complaints was to read and log and respond and then file, which meant the first complaint was in the filed state by the time the second arrived, and reading the filed one alongside the new one required a specific reason to go looking for it. The process had not given her that reason. She had processed each complaint as it arrived. She read Desmond Wright's complaint at 9 in the morning on a Friday. She read it twice because his complaint was the kind of complaint that benefited from a second reading. The kind where the precision of the language revealed more on the second pass than the first. She read the 5th paragraph twice on the first reading and again on the second. She said to no one, "He is asking me to read the prior complaints." She went to the prior complaints. Both prior complaints had been about Craig Morrison. The first had been filed 6 months ago by a parent named Charles Osei, who was 54. And a pediatric surgeon who had reported being stopped in the hallway during the spring drama production event and asked to produce documentation despite displaying his visitor lanyard and having checked in at the front desk. The complaint had been reviewed individually and addressed with a reminder to Morrison that visitor lanyards once issued at check-in were the appropriate verification for the event. The second had been filed 3 months ago by a parent named Angela Washington, who was 49 and a university administrator who had reported being stopped twice during the fall curriculum information evening and asked to explain her presence in the school despite displaying her visitor lanyard and having checked in. The complaint had been reviewed individually and addressed with a meeting with Morrison in which his supervisor had reiterated the verification procedure. Elena Marquez read all 3 complaints together. She read them in the sequence they had been filed. Charles Osei in April, Angela Washington in July, Desmond Wright in October. She read each one in full. She took notes. She read them again. She had been a parent relations director for 5 years. She knew what a pattern looked like and what a coincidence looked like, and this was not a coincidence. 3 complaints, 3 black parents, all with valid check-in documentation. All stopped in the hallway and asked to produce additional verification. In the first case, Morrison had received a reminder. In the second, he had received a meeting with his supervisor. In the third, he had encountered a man who had taken precise sequential notes within 2 hours of the event and had filed them in a 5-paragraph complaint that specifically asked whether the prior complaints had been reviewed in sequence. Elena read all 3 complaints in the sequence they had been filed. She read Charles Osei's complaint from April. She read Angela Washington's complaint from July. She read Desmond Wright's complaint from October. She set them side by side on her desk in printed form, which was something she rarely did. She usually worked from the screen, but this required the kind of comparison that was easier to do when the documents were physical objects she could see simultaneously. She read them side by side. 3 complaints. 6 months between the first and the third, all 3 involving parents who had checked in at the front desk and received the schedule card and had been stopped in the hallway by the same staff member and asked to produce additional verification. All 3 parents were black. No complaint from any of the parents who had not been stopped. 3 black parents stopped on 3 separate occasions, all at evening events, all by Craig Morrison. She had processed each of these complaints individually. She had read each one. She had logged each one. She had managed the response, the reminder, the meeting, the supervisor's restatement of the procedure. She had done her job with each complaint. The job had not required her to read them together. The process had not required it. But the process had not produced what was now visible to her in 3 minutes of reading them, side by side, the pattern which was the thing the individual complaints had described in pieces, and that the sequential reading was describing whole. She picked up the phone. She called the head of school. Dr. Margaret Holloway had been the head of school at Millbrook Prep for 9 years. She had built the school's reputation for academic rigor and its culture of parent partnership over those 9 years, and she regarded both as serious responsibilities. She had come to school leadership from a background in curriculum development and had served as a department head and then an academic dean before the headship, and she had a specific orientation toward institutional problems. She believed the most useful question to ask about any institutional problem was not who was at fault, but what the institution had produced and what in the institution's design had produced it. This orientation had made her a good head of school. It had also, over 9 years, made her very good at reading complaints. She received Elena's call at 8 in the morning. She listened to the summary. She said, "Send me the 3 complaints." Elena sent them. She read them within the hour. She read them with the specific attention she gave to documents that described institutional conduct rather than individual conduct, which was the orientation that Elena's framing of the call had prepared her for. She was looking for what the institution had produced. The institution had produced 3 interactions between the same staff member and 3 black parents with valid event documentation across 3 separate events over 6 months. Each interaction had produced a complaint. Each complaint had been processed individually. The individual processing had not produced a change in the staff member's conduct, because the individual processing had addressed each incident as if it were isolated, which it was not. She called the facilities director, a man named Robert Cavallo, who had supervised Morrison since Morrison's first day at the school. She called the facilities director, a man named Robert Cavallo, who had supervised Morrison since Morrison's first day at the school. She asked Cavallo to pull Morrison's personnel file and the documentation of the 2 prior complaint responses. She asked him to meet with her at noon. The noon meeting lasted 90 minutes. It covered the 3 complaints, the 2 prior responses, the training Morrison had received at orientation regarding the visitor verification procedure, and the gap between that training and his documented conduct. It also covered the visitor badge situation. The investigation revealed that the school did use visitor badges during evening events, but the front desk check-in process had not been consistently issuing them, and the facilities staff had not been consistently verifying them, and the gap between the policy and the practice had created a situation in which a staff member who believed the badge was required could stop parents who were fully authorized to be at the event because they had not received a badge that the event process had failed to give them. The gap was in the check-in process. The gap had allowed the stop to be framed as procedure, even when the procedural failure was in the institution's own check-in, not in the parents' compliance. Holloway had said to Cavallo at the noon meeting, the check-in process failed to issue the badges. Morrison used the absence of the badge as justification for stopping parents. 3 of those parents were black. No substantive complaint has been received from a non-black parent. She had said there are 2 separate problems here. The first is the check-in process. The second is the selection. She had said the check-in process is fixable and we are going to fix it. She had said the selection cannot be fixed by procedure alone because the procedure is not what drove the selection. She had said, I want you to understand what we are addressing and why we are addressing it the way we are. Cavallo had said, I understand. She had said, good. By the end of the meeting, Holloway had decided 4 things. Morrison would be placed on administrative leave pending a full review. A full review would be conducted by Cavallo and the school's HR director within 5 business days. The visitor verification procedure would be reviewed, and a written protocol would be produced clarifying what facilities staff were authorized to ask of visitors who had already checked in, and all 3 complainants would receive written notification of the school's response to their complaints, including the steps being taken. She also made a 5th decision. She was going to call Desmond Wright, personally. She called him at 4 in the afternoon on his direct number that Elena had provided from the parent directory. He answered. She said, "Mr. Wright." He said, "Yes." She said, "This is Dr. Margaret Holloway, head of school at Millbrook Prep." He said, "Dr. Holloway." She said, "I have read your complaint and the 2 prior complaints in our file. I want to speak with you directly about what happened and what we are going to do about it." He said, "I appreciate you calling." She said, "I want to start by acknowledging what you described and by telling you directly that it should not have happened." He said, "Thank you." She said, "I also want to tell you that the question you asked in the 5th paragraph of your complaint, whether the prior complaints had been reviewed in sequence, was the specific question that allowed me to see what I am now seeing clearly." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why did you ask it?" He said, "Because I suspected I was not the first." She said, "You were the 3rd." He said, "Yes." He said, "I thought it was possible." She told him the steps being taken. He listened. He took notes. He asked 2 follow-up questions. She answered them. The call was 22 minutes long. He called Yvonne after. She was between patients and took the call standing in the hallway of her practice. He told her about the call. She said, "Holloway called you personally?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Within 1 day of the complaint?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And there were 2 prior complaints she had not known to read together?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Desmond?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The 5th paragraph?" He said, "Yes." She said, "You knew to ask it?" He said, "I suspected." She said, "You knew?" He said, "I've been editing documents for 25 years. He said, "I know when a sentence is doing work and when it is not." He said, "The 5th paragraph was doing work." She said, "Yes." She said it was. She called him back at 8 that evening when she was home. She said, "I have been thinking about the 2 prior parents all day." He said, "Yes." She said, "Charles Osei?" He said, "Yes." She said, "A pediatric surgeon?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Stopped in the hallway with a visitor lanyard?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Filed a complaint and got a reminder?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And then Angela Washington?" He said, "Yes." She said, "A university administrator?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Stopped twice?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Got a meeting?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And then you?" He said, "Yes." She said, "An editor who put the 5th paragraph in his complaint?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Desmond?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Do you think Charles Osei and Angela Washington know what the 5th paragraph did?" He said, "They will know what the 3 complaints together did." He said, "Holloway is writing to all 3 of us." She said, "But the 5th paragraph?" He said, "They will know that the 3rd complaint triggered the sequential review." She said, "Do they know why the 3rd complaint triggered it when the first 2 didn't?" He said, "The first 2 didn't ask." She said, "Will they know that?" He said, "I don't know." She said, "I think they should." He said, "Yes." He said, "I think so too." He thought about this after the call. He thought about Charles Osei filing a complaint 6 months ago and being told it had been addressed and then going to subsequent events and possibly being stopped again, or not stopped and not knowing whether the complaint had changed anything and not knowing that there was a specific sentence in the 3rd complaint that had produced what 2 prior complaints had not. He thought about Angela Washington being stopped twice and filing a complaint and getting a meeting and not knowing that 7 weeks later, someone was going to file a complaint with a 5th paragraph that asked for the sequential review that would reveal the pattern that made her complaint matter. He wrote to Elena Marquez the following morning. He said, "I want to ask whether it would be appropriate for me to write to the other 2 complainants." He said, "I am not asking for their contact information." He said, I am asking whether the school would be willing to facilitate a message from me to them if they are willing to receive it, explaining what the 5th paragraph of my complaint asked and why I asked it. He said, I think they are entitled to know the role their complaints played and the role my complaint played in enabling the sequential review that produced the outcome. Elena forwarded the message to Holloway. Holloway said yes. She facilitated the messages. Charles Osei responded, I appreciate you reaching out. I did not know to ask that. I know now. Angela Washington responded the 5th paragraph. She had said thank you. She had said I'm going to use that sentence. The formal notification arrived 3 days later by email. It described the steps that had been implemented and the timeline for the review. It thanked Desmond for the specificity of his complaint and for the question he had asked. He read it at his desk. He read it twice, as he read everything that warranted careful reading. He noted the phrase specificity of his complaint, which was the phrase he would have used about a document that had been written correctly for its purpose. A document that described what needed to be described and asked for what needed to be asked and did not describe or ask for more or less than the situation required. He noted the phrase, the question he had asked, which was the phrase for the 5th paragraph. He thought about the fact that the notification letter, which was a formal institutional document from the head of school, had used these phrases, which were the phrases that an editor would use to describe a well-constructed document. Because the complaint had been a well-constructed document, and because the person reading it had recognized that, and because the recognition was what had allowed the response to be what it was. He filed the notification. He went back to work. He had a manuscript on his desk, a history of cartographic technique that was 500 pages in draft and that needed to come down to 350, and he picked it up. He had been editing the history of cartographic technique for 6 weeks. He had another 4 weeks to go. He opened to the section on 16th century Mediterranean charts and read the paragraph he had left off at on Monday. He made a note in the margin. He turned the page. The complaint was filed. The review was complete. The procedure was changed. The 3 complainants were notified. The record was what it was. His job now was the cartography. He thought not for the first time that editing and complaining were both forms of the same activity, which was reading something carefully enough to identify the gap between what it was and what it was supposed to be, and then describing the gap in terms specific enough that the gap could be closed. He had been doing this for 25 years with manuscripts. He had done it once with a facilities coordinator at a school in October in a hallway, and then again that night at the kitchen table, and then again in 5 paragraphs filed through the parent portal the next morning. The method was the same. The document was different. The gap had been closed. That was what the method was for. The review concluded in 4 business days. The findings were Morrison had applied the visitor verification standard, inconsistently stopping parents for secondary verification after they had already completed check-in, and the documentation of 3 incidents showed a consistent pattern of applying this standard to black parents. The 2 prior responses had addressed the incidents individually without connecting them to each other or to the possibility of a pattern. The new protocol required that any complaint about facilities staff conduct during visitor events trigger a review of prior complaints about the same staff member. Morrison's employment was terminated on the 5th business day. Dr. Holloway wrote to all 3 complainants. She wrote to Desmond, to Charles Osei, and to Angela Washington. She said, I want to tell you that your complaint was not reviewed alone. It was reviewed alongside the complaints filed by the other 2 parents, and the pattern that the sequential review revealed is what made the full response possible. She wrote this to each of them personalized because each of them had filed their complaint without knowing the others had filed theirs, and each of them deserved to know what had happened to make the complaints matter. Charles Osei called Elena Marquez's office when he received the letter. He said, I was told my complaint was being addressed. He said I assumed addressed meant a conversation. Elena said it did mean a conversation. It meant a conversation and a reminder. She said it should have meant more, and it would have if we had read all 3 complaints together when yours arrived. He said you didn't read them together. She said no. She said we read them individually. She said that was the gap in the process. She said the gap is now closed. He was quiet. He said, all right. He said, I am glad the 3rd person asked the question. Elena said yes. She said, so are we. Angela Washington wrote back to Dr. Holloway. She wrote, I was stopped twice during the curriculum evening. I did not file a more formal complaint because I assumed it would not produce anything different from what the first complaint had produced. She said, I want you to know that I now know what the first complaint produced, and I know what the combination of all 3 produced, and I want you to know that I am glad the 3rd parent was the kind of person who asked whether the complaints had been reviewed in sequence. Dr. Holloway wrote back, so am I. She said, I want to tell you that the new procedure we have implemented requires that a second complaint about the same staff member triggers a sequential review. She said if there had been a second complaint trigger in place, when your complaint arrived, your complaint would have been the last. Angela Washington wrote back, that is what I needed to hear. 3 months after the complaint and the review and the termination and the procedure change, Imani was named one of 4 recipients of the state's Junior Achievement Award in Mathematics and Literature, which was an award administered by the state's Independent School Association and given annually to students who had demonstrated exceptional academic work that crossed disciplinary boundaries. The award committee's citation said, for work that demonstrates the ways mathematical reasoning and literary analysis illuminate each other, and for the insight to understand that this illumination is bidirectional. Mrs. Castellano had nominated her. The committee had selected her. Desmond and Yvonne had been notified by Dr. Holloway in a letter that said, I want to be among the first to tell you that Imani has been selected. The letter had arrived on a Thursday. Desmond had been at work. Yvonne had been at the practice. Both of them had read it within the hour of its arrival. Desmond had called Yvonne from his office. She had said, I know. He had said she is 17. She had said yes. He had said she is going to figure out what she wants to do with it. She had said she already knows. He had said, does she? Yvonne had said she told me 2 weeks ago. She said, I think I want to study something that does not have a name yet. She had said, and then she said, or maybe I will name it. Desmond had been quiet for a moment. He had said yes. He had said, that sounds right. Yvonne had said 12 years of parent-teacher nights. He had said yes. She had said, and she is going to name something. He had said yes. He had said, I am going to sit with that for a while. She had said yes. She had said me too. The award ceremony was in February. Desmond and Yvonne both attended, which required Yvonne to rearrange 2 morning appointments and Desmond to clear the afternoon. They went together. Dr. Holloway was there. Mrs. Castellano was there. The award was presented in the State Association's conference auditorium in a ceremony that lasted 2 hours and recognized multiple categories of student achievement. Imani was the 4th award recipient in the mathematics and literature category. She received the award and said thank you to the committee, and said on behalf of her teachers that the work the award recognized was not work she had done alone. The committee chair said it rarely is. Imani said no. She said, but it is rarely acknowledged. The committee chair looked at her. He said, that is an astute observation for a junior. She said it is an astute observation for anyone. Desmond in the audience looked at Yvonne. Yvonne looked at him. Neither of them said anything. They watched their daughter shake the committee chair's hand and return to her seat. In the car on the way home, Imani said Mrs. Castellano's nomination was very specific. He said yes. She said she described the specific essay. He said yes. She said the one about the Fibonacci sequence and the narrative structure of Genesis. He said yes. She said I wasn't sure that essay was worth nominating. He said Mrs. Castellano was sure. She said yes. She said she was. She was quiet for a moment. She said Dad. He said yes. She said the complaint. He said yes. She said the 5th paragraph. He said yes. She said I want to use that sentence. He said which sentence? She said I would like to know whether those complaints have been reviewed in sequence or individually because the pattern of such complaints may be more informative than any individual complaint read alone. He was quiet. He said you memorized it. She said I read the complaint when you showed it to us. He said yes. She said I memorized that paragraph. He said yes. She said, it is the most useful sentence in the complaint. He said yes. He said it is the one that did the most work. She said, I want to know how to write that sentence. He said, you know how to write that sentence. She said, I know how to write about Fibonacci sequences in Genesis. He said yes. He said, and you know how to write that sentence. He said you have been writing toward it for 3 years in Mrs. Castellano's class. She said that's different. He said, is it? She was quiet. He said the sentence works because it understands why the single instance is not enough. She said yes. He said, and it knows that understanding the pattern requires the full sequence. She said yes. He said you write about patterns for a living. She said I'm 17. He said for a living so far? She laughed. He said you will write that sentence when you need to. She said yes. She said, and now I know what it does. He said yes. He said now you know. Imani Wright did not know about the complaint until her father told her the following Sunday at dinner. He told her what had happened. She listened. She said at parent-teacher night. He said yes. She said in the hallway between chemistry and literature. He said yes. She said, and Mrs. Castellano. He said I was 2 minutes late. She said she didn't say anything to me. He said I apologized when I came in. She said she didn't say anything to me. He said no. She said she wouldn't. She was quiet for a moment. She said, did you get everything you needed from the meetings? He said yes. He said all of them. She said, and you filed a complaint. He said yes. She said the same night. He said the next morning. She said with a 5th paragraph. He said yes. She said what did the 5th paragraph say? He told her. She was quiet again. She said, and they read them in sequence. He said yes. She said, and there were 2 other complaints. He said yes. He said 2 other black parents. She said, and they were the same. He said yes. She said all 3. He said yes. She was quiet for a longer moment. She said, Dad. He said yes. She said the 5th paragraph. He said yes. She said that's what you do. He said yes. He said I edit for a living. She said you know when a sentence is doing work. He said yes. She said so does Mrs. Castellano. He said yes. She said that's why she's my teacher. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said yes. He said probably. She said how many people read your books? He said it depends on the book. He said some are read by a few dozen specialists, some by several thousand. She said, do they know you edited them? He said generally not. She said so your work is in them and you are not. He said yes. He said that is the job. She said the 5th paragraph is in the record. He said yes. She said, and the record changed something. He said yes. She said so your work is in that too, and you are not. He thought for a moment. He said the complaint is on file with my name on it. She said yes. She said, but the outcome, the procedure changed, the other complaints read together. That is in the school's process now, and it doesn't say Desmond Wright. He said no. He said it says revised protocol October. She said, and that is also the job. He said yes. She said yes. She said, I see. She was quiet. He was quiet. Yvonne looked at them both from across the table. She said, are you two going to eat? They ate. The award was announced in the school newsletter the following week with a photograph of Imani and the committee chair and the citation text. The newsletter went to all Millbrook Prep families. Desmond read it at his desk at the publishing house. He thought 347 titles. And this is the thing I am most proud of having had a part in. He thought not really having a part in. She did the work herself with Yvonne and with Mrs. Castellano, and with the specific interior engine that had been running in her since the first grade, and that he and Yvonne had tried to fuel without directing. He thought you are not supposed to take credit for this. He thought I am not taking credit. He thought I am noting that I was there for 12 years of parent-teacher nights. He thought the 12 years of parent-teacher nights is something I did. He thought, and the 5th paragraph is something I did. He thought. The 5th paragraph is in the record, and Imani's award is in the record, and neither of them requires the other, but both of them happened in the same year, and that is enough. He filed the newsletter in the folder he kept at home that contained Imani's significant academic documents, the acceptance letter to Millbrook Prep, the notable essays, the awards. The folder had been growing since the first grade. He filed the newsletter behind the complaint acknowledgement and the formal notification of the review outcome, which he had filed there intentionally because both of them were part of what it had looked like to be Imani's parent at Millbrook Prep in her junior year, and the folder was the record of what that had looked like. The record as his father had told him when Desmond was young and his father was reviewing some document for some purpose that Desmond had not been old enough to understand. The record is the story you leave behind for the people who were not there. Desmond had been young when his father said it. He had understood it completely by the time he was 25 and had been editing documents for a living for 3 years. He had never forgotten it. The folder was the story for the people who were not there. The people who were not there were everyone who would come after, including Imani herself at 20 or 30 or 50. Looking back at the folder and reading what the year had looked like and understanding from the record what her father had done in the hallway at 7:43 on a Thursday evening in October when a facilities coordinator had asked him for documentation he had already provided. He had described what he saw. He had asked for the pattern to be examined. He had gone to his daughter's AP Literature appointment 2 minutes late and had used the 13 minutes that remained to ask Mrs. Castellano the follow-up question that produced the most useful information of the evening. He had gone home and written it down. He had filed the complaint the next morning. He had produced the 5th paragraph in the same column he produced everything he wrote, because the column was what the work required, and because he had been doing the work for 25 years, and the column was reliable. Angela Washington had written, "I am going to use that sentence." He thought about this. He thought about what it would mean for Angela Washington to have the sentence available the next time she needed it at another school, another event, another institution where something had happened that needed a complaint, and the complaint needed a 5th paragraph. He thought about Charles Osei having the sentence. He thought about the sentence traveling from the complaint through the notification letter through his message to the other complainants into the understanding of 2 people who had filed complaints before him and who now knew what the 5th paragraph was for. He thought 347 titles in 11 years. He thought, and also this. He thought the sentence is in the world now. It is in Angela Washington's vocabulary and Charles Osei's vocabulary, and in Imani's, who had memorized it from the complaint her father had shown her on a Sunday at dinner. He thought the sentence will go where those people go, and will do what the sentence does when those people need it. He thought that is also publication. He thought it is the smallest publication I have done in 11 years and 347 titles, and the one I am most satisfied with. He went back to the 16th century Mediterranean charts and the history of cartographic technique that needed to come down to 350 pages. He turned the page. He had been going to parent-teacher nights for 12 years. He had sat in small chairs at 3 schools and had taken notes and asked follow-up questions, and come home with the information that was in the follow-up questions, and not in the first answers. He had done this because it was what the situation required, and because he was the parent who could be there, and because the work of being present for 12 years had produced, among other things, a daughter, who had been named to the State Achievement Award in Mathematics and Literature, and who had memorized the 5th paragraph of her father's complaint, and who said, "I am going to use that sentence." He thought that was a good enough account of 12 years. He thought the sentence is the most useful thing I have given her. He thought except for the 12 years. He thought the 12 years made the sentence possible. He thought yes. That is right. Subscribe our channel. We follow the fathers who know when a sentence is doing work and who have been sitting in small chairs for 12 years so that the sentence, when it comes, has something to stand on. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Comment your thoughts or similar experiences. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Comment your thoughts or similar experiences.